All right, so I think that's me then.
Then that is you. Well, I'll introduce you, Kelly, since you don't have to introduce yourself.
I can. No shame in doing it.
She's the Director of Government Relations, and she leads the Main Street America's work to uplift the role of Main Street organizations to policy and decision makers. She works alongside the networks coordinating and local Main Streets in defending and growing their programs, and supports efforts to advocate for federal support for Main Street programs. And I just want to thank Kelly so much for all of her efforts. She has been really helpful in helping to lead us to folks to support our programs. And I think we're starting to make some headway and looking at potential funding for California, which has not been here for many, many years. So thank you so much, Kelly.
Well, and congratulations to everybody in California for also making those inroads. And I hope that we can be, crafting concepts that bring together kind of the federal and local and state to make sure that we're all moving forward. And at the basis of that is really just broad advocacy, kind of general work. And so we're going to go back to basics a little bit in this. Patrice was talking about the Revitalizing Small Businesses Act and earmarks and all of that that's available or coming out. And I want to say part of that, as she alluded to, is just making sure that we have the groundwork laid, right? So that we understand how to make sure that advocacy is part of Main Street programs on a regular basis through work planning, crafting a message, understanding our restrictions, and reaching out to legislators. So I'll also note, I'm notoriously fast in talking. I'll apologize in advance if I get off track. All of my notes say continually slow down. So while I'm going to try to be respectful of time and make sure that we cover everything we want to cover, if you need me to slow down or if you have a question, please go ahead and just throw a hand up or interrupt because sometimes I do just get into it. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So just as we're thinking about general advocacy here, I want to make sure that we are at first thinking about kind of the structural support that you have at the basis of your Main Street program, right? So this is just how maybe a Main Street program is structured. This should be pretty familiar to you. It's probably close to what you have on the ground. I want you to keep in mind that this structural support mechanism is also a great advocacy tool. So for those of you who are executive directors, advocacy might often feel like it just falls to you, or it's something that's kind of like, hey, Carol, do that, right? And instead of being something that is really planned and thought through, right? You might be responding to a moment, responding to an issue, but I want to take you back to make sure that you're using the grassroots structure of Main Street. You have at the very bottom of this tier, all of your local supporters, business owners, and residents who can help you carry a message, help you share your story, and help you have strength in numbers for any type of advocacy that you're doing. You also have committees who you can align around advocacy plans and individual policy priorities, right? Thinking about the different ways that Main Street can adapt different policies. And you also have your board and your board of directors, and they should be actively engaged in your advocacy efforts. Beyond needing maybe their thoughts and permission to make sure that everybody is aligned around an advocacy goal, they can also be your grass tops connections. Reach out maybe to that person on city council or to that state legislator's office and help drive those important connections. So always refer back to your structure because it's what's there for you at the core. Next slide, please. But Main Street really, through the 4-point approach, you will have many, many different areas that you could think about for advocacy because Main Street is so interdisciplinary, right? So part of that goal is to siphon out where exactly your advocacy priorities should belong in a work planning process and what those priorities should be. So you could see yourself in the realm of small business support and historic preservation, tourism, all the way across the 4 points, and all at the different levels, state, local, federal. That's kind of big to tackle. So through the Main Street approach, though, you can see that there is this core element that I've kind of highlighted here of capacity building for your program or for your coordinating program at the state level. And that really belongs and pertains to the organization point. And advocacy is also kind of core to the organization point. So I really encourage you when you're thinking about how you want to plan advocacy in your programs, if you're not already including this in your regular annual work plans or at the board level, to think about what your organization committee's regular role is in considering advocacy. I would say that they're the leader, your board is the leader, Your advocacy, your organization chair needs to be in a leadership position in advocacy, but you also want to engage all of the other committees, because if there's design work that's happening and is utilizing historic tax credits at the state level, and you could be advocating for funding for those credits, it's really a combination of those two. So when you're thinking about how you plan for advocacy, make sure it's included in that organization point. Next slide, please. So I want to also just encourage you to make sure that advocacy is part of your regular work plans. Hopefully you've got your work plans laid out. I know at certain points during the year, maybe they can get off track and stuff, but if you have a regular work planning document and you don't have an advocacy item, consider what your advocacy goal could be and how it could be incorporated into those plans. For this as just an example, I kind of created one here that would be how you might go through a process of arranging a tour for a legislator. Tours are multimodal. You could have a tour that is pointing that legislator towards the value of your program. You could point them to a tour that showcases the value of a small business support incentive or a tax credit for historic structures. But tours are so essential for making sure that legislators see what's happening in your community. But it takes time. It takes time to plan a tour. You have to be cognizant of the legislator schedule, the session schedules. You have to be cognizant of the materials that you might want to hand out. And you have to be cognizant also of all of the different stakeholders that you have to arrange around those times that are really going to be at the behest of the legislator and their availability. So being flexible and planning around that might require that you really write this out as part of your plans and goals. This is just one example. It's kind of low cost, of course, but it also does take a lot of time and effort to organize. So I want to make sure that we're showcasing this as something that you should be regularly including in those plans. Next slide, please. Okay. So thinking about those advocacy goals, one of the things that I would encourage you to really think about too, what are you advocating for? What can you put on your priorities list if you were to make a priorities list? You need to think about being both planned out, as we've talking about, but also flexible, because things will come up. Obviously, we know with the pandemic, things will come up, but new advocacy priority might present itself. You maybe want to incorporate that, but you also want to have just the general outreach and regular support of your program kind of planned in on a regular basis. If you have a transformation strategy that is specific to a specific type of advocacy, that might be one advocacy goal you want to include. If you have an arts-based transformation strategy, what is Americans for the Arts or the California Arts Alliance planning and advocating for? You might want to include those goals as part of your goals. What can you incorporate into your work plan? Again, think about how it can be done in the organization committee. And I can't emphasize enough, of course, because I'm saying it twice, being prepared for the unexpected challenges or opportunities that you want to be able to respond to as well. So if you have somebody who's designated as an advocacy leader in the organization, can that person be both helping arrange the regular advocacy activities? Can they also be the person that's designated to respond if there is something that's a hot button issue that emerges? Okay. So beyond that, I want to talk about crafting an advocacy message, right? So you've got some plans. Now you're going to actually make a step to outreach to someone. We've all done it before, but or hopefully you have, but I think that there is an opportunity to just step back. And what I constantly do for myself is to think through kind of, am I tackling these different areas of the message as I prepare to deliver it and as I deliver it. Click once again. Okay, there's my Waldo guy. I'll refer to him again, but I think I always want to make sure, I think it's really fun to think about. You can remember when you enter a conversation with anybody who's in a decision-making arena, whether that's at local, state, federal, but particularly the higher up rung that you go, you really have to think of yourself as like, where's Waldo, right? There are hundreds of people trying to vie for maybe the staff members or the legislators' attention. And reminding yourself, taking a step back and thinking, okay, until I build this relationship, this person does not know what I do. And when we say Main Street, sometimes it is so ubiquitous. So if you think about yourself as the where's Waldo of the situation, you really have to carve out as your first step who you are. So next slide. Okay. Establishing who you are requires you to make sure that you have a very well-defined pitch, right? What are the basic details about your organization? What do you do? Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm from Main Street America. we advocate for the for preservation-based economic development in commercial corridors across the country. That's, you know, where I could start, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean much. So you have to be ready to respond to the questions. And one of the best ways that I've found, and got this tip from Renee Kuhlman, who many of you might know, when you get into conversation with somebody, if you're talking to a legislator, you're talking to a person's office, one of the best ways to just get the ball rolling sometimes is to say, are you familiar with our organization? Just start off and say, hi, you know, I'm Kelly, I work at Main Street America. Are you familiar with the work that we do in communities across the country? Or are you familiar with the work that we're doing in downtown X, right? And allow that person to respond, because they might then allude to you what they know, but it also might tell you what they don't know. I can say that question and sometimes get the response, oh yeah, you all are the people that rehab the historic properties. Yes, we are. We are the people that rehab those historic properties in commercial corridors, but we also are the people that are helping those entrepreneurs get into those historic properties. And that's why I want to tell you about the Revitalizing Small and Local Businesses Act. So if you allow it to be conversational when you introduce this, if this is a conversation that you're having with someone, rather than maybe a letter, it's really great to make sure that you are seeing and monitoring what they know about you a little bit, so that you can respond to that and help redirect to make sure you're giving the full scope of what Main Street does. Next step would be making sure that you are stating one clear problem that you are asking whoever you're talking to address. Many times we see that many of our problems are interrelated, right? Because of the parking issues, businesses are upset, and that might be causing a problem with an event, and they're all wrapped together. Yes, absolutely. When you are approaching somebody in a decision-making environment, I encourage you to resist the temptation to go down the rabbit hole and make the problem more than the scope of what that person could reasonably solve in the time frame that you have with them. You maybe have 30 minutes with somebody to explain. Be very concise. Make sure that you illuminate with data if you can, and make sure that you give a sense of urgency, or at least a timeline, right? If you don't tell somebody that this needs to be solved by this time because of whatever realm of the world, they'll put it on the back burner because there's somebody else that's giving them a problem that has a more urgent timeline. That's what they might address first. So just make sure that that does come with some parameters around it, not just, I have a problem, right? Every person that's coming to them has a problem to solve. So make sure that you really illuminate your problem as best you can. Step 3, create a sense of shared values. People solve problems because it's their job to solve problems, legislators and other policymakers, but they also do it because it's important to them. And they have gone beyond just the facts and figures to a space of having an emotional connection. You, as Main Street leaders, have a really fantastic way to make that connection. It is place-based. You are telling somebody why this matters to the place that they live, to communities where they maybe grew up. You can actually, in many circumstances, do a tiny bit of research on someone. Don't be creepy, but do a tiny bit of research on someone to say, you know, maybe that person comes from another community that would like to start a Main Street program, but hasn't had the opportunity yet. Because there's more funding needed at the state level, right? Make sure that you are doing a good job of adding the story into the data to make that connection. And there are so many ways that you can do that easily with Main Street, of course. You know, small businesses are the heart of our community. Our downtowns are the places that make our entire communities thrive. Those are the easy statements, but there's ways to go beyond that, of course. Step 4 is to have the solution, right, in mind. So hopefully, based on your advocacy goals, partners that you might have, whether that's something that you're seeing from Main Street America that's, hey, this federal piece could be helpful to us, something Amanda's telling you about that at the state level could be helpful, or something you've organized locally, make sure that you have a solution in mind. Now, your solution might not be the only solution, and it is extremely important that you listen carefully in conversation with any sort of legislative office to understand what they might think the solution is, right? Because through their conversations with others, they might have other ways for you to tackle that. So please don't be so aligned with your own solution that you can't see that they might be offering you an olive branch someplace else. But it is important that you have a way for them to resolve that very clear statement of problem that you gave them, and that you are asking for an action. If not, I mean, there's obviously a lot of value to building relationships with people, but when you're coming with a specific goal, make sure that you are giving a way for them to overcome the problem to achieve that goal. So that's my 4-part solution for communicating to an advocacy message. I want to just highlight quickly though that messaging tactic is mostly used when you are trying to achieve a specific goal, right? When you are asking for, I have this specific purpose. That may be in a moment where you might be lobbying, and a lot of folks have concerns about whether or not they, as a 501c3 organization, if you are a 501c3, how you are allowed to lobby. It's a lot of resistance that we have seen over time in the Main Street Network about kind of a lack of comfort with making specific lobbying requests. First, I just want to highlight that if you are educating, building relationships, just inviting somebody to the community so that you can have more interaction with them and so that they understand your work better, that is educational. That is not considered lobbying. That's general advocacy, and there shouldn't be any hangups with you doing that. Now, when you lobby, you're making a specific request to a legislator. I am asking you to co-sponsor this legislation, or you're asking your supporters in your district to take an action. I'm asking you all to write in support of this legislation. That is lobbying generally, and it is allowable as long as you're within certain limits for the IRS. Now, those limits depend on the size of your budget, right? So there's a different percentage point based on the type and scale of your organization. It would be very difficult and probably unwise for me to tell you whether or not you would ever be at those limits because I don't know about the specific parameters of your work. The best way to ensure that you would feel comfortable doing that is to talk to your accountant, your attorney, if you have one on your board, or if you're engaged in one regularly, to make sure that those lobbying activities don't go outside of the norm. But it's often that limit is a little bit higher than what you might think it is. And typically one action is not indicative of lobbying. It's multiple actions that you would take on an issue over time.
Good question there.
Is lobbying limited to advocating for against specific bills? If you're if you are advocating for a general issue, is that considered lobbying? It depends exactly, Bianca. I guess it depends whether or not you are asking for an action on that, right? If you're asking for a specific action related to taking steps to a specific bill, that would be lobbying. But I guess the way that you phrased that question, I would consider that more general advocacy. But again, I'm not an attorney, so I like to also always refer people to others. And there's lots of also guidance on the online where you could delve into a longer program on that fine line. So just one last little bit here on just ways that you can make that connection with legislative offices. If you are, if you don't have those connections and you're trying to start, getting into the realm of how can I reach out to these folks? How can I get connected? Make sure that you're utilizing both kind of the grassroots and the grass tops. And here's what I mean by that very kind of specific example. If I reach out to a congressional office, I might not know them. I might know them a little bit. I might have a connection. I might look to one of our statewide coordinating partners. I might look to a local leader and say, hey, do you have a connection in this office? That's called grass tops, right? When I'm working through that very specific kind of, maybe this person, they've done work together before, they play golf together, grass tops advocacy. Now, if I share and have a meeting with that person, I might follow up with, hey, here's all the supporters of this, and actually send them a letter that lists, all the people in their district who have signed on in support of an issue, so that I can show them that this is not just me, not just this connection that they know, but it's a lot of folks, right? So, if you were able to uplift the voices of people in your community in support of something, that's a great way to strengthen those connections. Again, focus on one issue at a time and be prepared with your message. there is a possibility that you could focus on two issues, but there's often a time that if you're speaking to a staff person, it's actually somebody else that might handle that other issue, right? So they might have somebody who's completely separate. And so it would be hard to fit both in one. It might be also just hitting a brick wall a little bit. Make sure if you are planning an interaction with someone that your team is aligned. It is entirely appropriate if you're going to have a call with a decision maker that the call might be 30 minutes. You might want to take, another whole 30-minute call in advance just to make sure that everybody that would be on the call is aligned. What you really don't want to do is get on with somebody and then have one person say something entirely unexpected or off script, right? So you want people to be able to speak the truth, speak from their hearts, but you also want to know how that flow is going to go before you do that. Make sure you understand a little bit of research about the legislator, what their priorities are. Never underestimate a staff relationship. Staff are invaluable to making the connection and making sure that the legislator receives your message. If they don't trust you and you don't have the relationship with them, it'll be very hard for you to maintain that relationship with the legislator. Even if you knew the legislator personally, respect the staff greatly. Never ever lie on a call like that. If you don't know, say, I don't know, and find out and follow up. It is perfectly reasonable and expected that you wouldn't be able to answer every question, but also will help you immensely if you can be cognizant about any questions that came up and a polite response when you find the answer. But always, of course, be kind and courteous and thank the staff person or the legislator for their time, and thank them after that. Thank them even if there was not a positive result, thank them at the end of the engagement, no matter what, and keep the relationship alive in that manner. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I think Bianca is going to take over.
Well, welcome, Bianca. So Bianca Bloomquist directs small business majorities legislative and policy efforts statewide. She develops relationships with small business owners and stakeholders to empower the authentic voice of small businesses in California. Previously, Bianca worked for Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison in his capacity in the U.S. Congress during the passage of the Affordable Care Act and Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, and on federal transportation, healthcare, labor, and trade issues in Washington, D.C. She has also campaigned in California, Minnesota, and Wisconsin on state and national initiatives that impact the status of working families throughout the country. And Bianca is also a board member for California Main Street. And so we are so proud to have her and her support. So Bianca, take it away.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that kind introduction. This conference has been so fun so far. I hope folks that are attending today were able to attend yesterday, especially the history tour and the kind of spooky images that one could see if they were to visit the town of Eureka in person. So I just thought that was really cool. And of course, it's a pleasure to speak on a panel with Kelly. Kelly, you're such a wealth of information. Even though I think that we've paneled together before, every time I hear you speak, I learn something new. And something that really stuck with me with what Kelly said is, developing relationships before with legislatures before you need something is super important. And then also not to underestimate the staffers, especially the schedulers. They can oftentimes be the most finicky, but also the folks that you really want on your side. They kind of make everything happen. But anyway, all that to say, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for giving the opportunity for Small Business Majority to share a little bit about the work that we're doing. I know we have had so many amazing sessions already this conference, so I really wanted to share and underscore a couple of items that I thought might not be touched on, at least not in great depth. And so the primary focus of today's conversation from my perspective is going to be how city and local government leaders can take advantage of the federal dollars that are coming down the pike by way of the American Rescue Plan to support small business owners, to support small business employees, to support main streets, and to support working families. And so before I do that, a little bit about my organization. We're also a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We engage in third-party independent polling of small business owners nationwide, as well as independent polling and network surveys of our network of approximately 85,000 small business owners. The bread and butter of our work is really, though, the education that we do in venues like this, oftentimes directly with small business owners on issues that are of importance to them. And we know what issues those are because of our surveys and our polling, where we ask small business owners what they're dealing with. The issue areas that we hear about the most oftentimes are, big ticket items, having a hard time accessing traditional bank lending, trying to buy a brick and mortar, trying to expand into their second or maybe even third location, business owners who want to hire their first employee or perhaps their third employee, business owners who are considering offering a 401k or a retirement plan, or business owners who are considering offering healthcare to their workforce. These are the big issues that we hear about most frequently from small business owners, but also increasingly, and I think that this is really interesting and important, the difficulty that small business owners are having in competing in general in a modern economy, particularly the platforms that are available to them. Think Square, think Google Pay, think Stripe, Facebook. There are many platforms that are increasingly necessary for small business owners to compete. However, what we're finding is that some of these platforms don't necessarily operate as fairly as others. So we are working on collecting those stories from small business owners, learning about the platforms that business owners are using, and figuring out from an educational standpoint, how can we help small business owners find the right product for them, and on a policy and advocacy standpoint, figuring out what kind of policies do small business owners need, both on a state and federal level, to compete equitably. A lot of this includes anti-monopoly and antitrust issues, but it really runs the gamut. So that's an overview of the kind of work that we do. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think I covered everything here. Okay, great. Thanks. Next slide. So I mentioned that I wanted to talk about the American Rescue Plan dollars. Just as a flag, when people are talking about the American Rescue Plan dollars, they're talking about the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. I can never remember that properly, but that is the program within the American Rescue Plan that essentially provides, I think, $350 billion from the federal government to local governments to essentially recover from COVID-19. I think this is the third tranche. This is the last kind of chunk of funds that are going to be reaching local governments. But the US Treasury Department released regulations to stakeholders outlining how they expected municipalities and counties to use these funds. And I mean, it was really broad. In other words, these local governments really can pick and choose exactly what types of programs they want to implement to support their local communities. So I am coming at this from a small business and working families perspective. We define small businesses as definitely less than 100 employees. But really, a lot of the micro businesses, which account for 80% of these small businesses in our state, have less than 10 employees. So what I'm coming at this from a very small business perspective. We included a couple of recommendations for folks that I wanted to outline here. They're also available online. But why invest in small business owners on Main Street? Small business owners are more likely to hire locally. I don't think this will be a surprise to many individuals. This is especially true for business owners of color and women business owners. I mentioned that research that Small Business Majority did. We had a really fascinating report that came out last year that underscored that business owners of color tend to hire more employees of color, and also women business owners tend to hire far more women than men do. I think the main takeaway is, people tend to hire people that look like them. And so as we talk about these kinds of investments, I want to make sure that the equity piece runs through everything, and we really continue to make the connection that investing in small business owners of color and investing in women business owners truly means investing in people of color and investing in women in general. Because again, these folks tend to hire locally, spend their dollars locally, and really uplift those local communities in their or economies in their community. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to make sure I have all my notes here. Okay, great. So most folks who are on the call are aware that SB 113 was passed as a measure of the early budget action items from Governor Newsom, essentially extending the supplemental paid sick leave that expired last year. The SB 113 essentially for California means that those employers with 26 employees or more need to offer a sick leave for special COVID-19 circumstances. And I bring this up because what the difference between this year and last year is that there were federal tax credits that were available for small business owners who had employees that were taking time off to care for a loved one who was sick or had childcare issues because of COVID. Well, that federal tax credit expired on September 30th. And since then, even with the state SB 113 bringing back that supplemental sick leave, there is currently no federal support for small business owners who have employees that are taking up to 80 hours of sick leave. So I wanted to underscore that one of the eligible uses of funds that was outlined in the guidance that I referenced earlier includes creating programs for reimbursement or even tax credits for small businesses who have employees that are taking time off work because of COVID. This is an eligible use of funds, and there are a number of cities throughout the state of California that have been creating their own sick leave and paid leave programs. Next slide, please. Right. Additionally, revolving loan funds and increasing loan guarantees, definitely a mouthful, and I am not a finance expert, but I can tell you that there have been a number of really innovative programs that have come about as a result of COVID-19 exacerbating the trouble that small business owners were having in accessing traditional loans. One eligible use of the funds for from the American Rescue Plan could include sorry, checking my text just to make sure it's not Alicia telling me I'm talking too fast. But one of the eligible uses of funds could include your local government investing in revolving loan funds. Now, these revolving loan funds can look like a whole bunch of different things. One example could include a county investing its tax dollars into an existing framework to essentially make loans to small business owners in their local community at 0% interest. This is something that San Francisco did. It was really cool. The county of Santa Clara did something similarly, except they didn't put the additional capital into the fund to get 0 interest loans. The city of San Jose is coming up with a fund, I think in a few weeks actually, of their own, and increasing loan guarantees. Just like the SBA guarantees loans, the state of California can guarantee loans as well. In fact, there's the state loan guarantee program that's unfortunately fairly underutilized by a lot of small business owners, but can provide a unique way for communities to think about creating a loan fund or a loan guarantee, or plugging into a loan guarantee program of their own. Next slide, please. I did include in my examples for a loan guarantee and revolving loan fund program, the California Rebuilding Fund, which I would be remiss if I didn't mention on this platform. But the California Rebuilding Fund is a great example of that, because it was built on an existing structure called the State Loan Guarantee Program that I mentioned, and essentially allows for different communities to plug into this loan fund while offering a standardized loan product for small business owners who need to recover equitably from COVID-19. And so while different locations plug into it differently, the loan itself for small business owners statewide looks the same. And it's affordable, which is number 1. It's transparent, which is number 2. It's 4.25% over a couple of years. So this really provides long-term recovery capital. So that's just an example. Other states are doing similar things. There's a flex fund up in Washington, and southern states are doing similar programs as well. So definitely something you might want to consider as a way to spend these dollars on small business owners in your community. Access to broadband, of course. This seems to be, I mean, this is obviously a huge issue. It's complicated, it's complex. There are a million different funding mechanisms that go into it. I'm sure a lot of you were supporters of SB4 last year, which essentially created a framework for additional investments into local community broadband solutions. So some ideas that we have come across, because we are a national organization, include states and localities, or excuse me, localities in Colorado that created their own community-led broadband programs. I also wanted to flag that because of the infrastructure bill, the IIJA, I apologize, I can't remember all the words, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, $64 billion of federal funding is going to be distributed for broadband projects. Now, what city and what city governments can do is create their own programs, invest in that money, and then essentially capitalize on the federal dollars that will be reaching these local governments to bolster the kinds of broadband projects that fit for each community. Because I think another thing that we've learned in the past, I don't know, however long broadband issues have been going on, it definitely is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and different communities are exploring very different ways of making sure that their communities have access to broadband. I'm thinking of Project Crenshaw, for example, plugging in local hospitals. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ideas out there. So definitely wanted to make sure that that was on the table. Next slide, please. Alicia, how am I on time? I'm about 2/3 of the way done.
You're good. You have about 20 minutes left.
Oh, geez.
Including Q&A.
Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah, and I do encourage folks to please put your questions into the chat box. I was on there earlier, really would appreciate any questions. There's no question that's too weird. Questions for Kelly as well. As I go through, please feel free to just throw them into the chat and we'll figure it out as we go. But would really love a robust discussion and bring forth any ideas that you all might have. You're all closer to these local economies than I am. I can only do so much as a statewide office, but if you have heard of or you're aware of upcoming programs and initiatives that are using these federal dollars in unique and interesting ways, please flag it for the group, because that's what this discussion is for, is to really foster that kind of discourse and streamlining of ideas.
Yeah, actually,
Just
Bianca,
want
I
to make
apologize.
sure we don't go through our break. We do
Yeah, I
have,
apologize. I just realized I misspoke.
Yeah.
We have a break coming up in a couple of minutes. So if we could maybe wrap up in about 5 or 6 minutes to allow
Yeah.
at least 10 minutes for a break, that would be fantastic.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, that
Yeah.
works.
thank you.
Okay, of course. Yeah, so get your questions in. You have about 5 minutes. Rent relief, a huge problem for small business owners. Unfortunately, very few of the legislative proposals that we saw last year included any relief for commercial leases. A number of cities are incorporating their own rent relief programs for small businesses specifically. This is also, I mentioned, keeping equity in focus. This is also a big issue for small business owners of color. 44% reported that they struggled to pay their rent. Almost 30% of women business owners were saying that they were struggling with paying their rent as well. So creating some kind of mortgage relief program would be a great idea for cities and local governments to use these American Rescue Plan dollars. Next slide. Thank you. Oh, technical assistance, of course. For those of you that might not be as familiar with some of the technical assistance providers in your community, technical assistance is a lifeline for small business owners, particularly those folks that do not have the funds to pay for a private consultant or a business advisor that they find independently on the internet usually. The small business development centers are quasi-governmental organizations that provide free one-on-one business advising for small business owners throughout the states. Some of these centers cover multiple counties. Some counties are lucky enough to have one center that covers the entire county. But the way that the network is structured is that each area of the state should have an SBDC that corresponds to it. If you're not familiar with your SBDC, your local SBDC, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to plug you in. But those aren't the only technical assistance providers out there. There are also women's business centers. The Women's Business Center Network in California is fantastic. They do amazing things. They also provide free one-on-one support for small business owners. And this support ranges from anything from creating a business plan to, marketing and advertising for your business. But it's free, number one. And there are a whole host of technical assistance providers in the state of California to help small business owners in your community. So you could use these American Rescue Plan dollars to bolster the work of these technical assistance providers. Licensing requirements and permitting costs. This was actually something that I've discussed with a number of folks that are on this call in the past, but there are a whole bunch of local ordinances that were at one point temporary and are now semi-permanent that they have decided to continue on with from the pandemic when it comes to, easing some requirements for allowing al fresco dining, for example, or allowing, on a state level, to-go alcoholic beverages are still allowed and will be allowed for the next couple of years with a couple of requirements. I'm happy to chat further with folks about that, but those are good examples of some of the licensing requirements and permitting costs that can really go a long way to support your local small business owners. And then lastly, of course, free money. Small business owners need grants. And what we do know, and it shouldn't be a surprise to most folks, is the less reporting requirements that are necessary, the more likely these dollars are to get into the hands of really marginalized business owners who are not parts of business organizations, like your local chamber, who might not be plugged into their local TA network, who might not be familiar with the great work that CAMS does, or Small Business Majority, or Main Street Alliance, or any folks. So targeted grants is always a great way to go. And I left that last just because I think that this one has gotten a lot of attention. But would be happy to chat with folks further about how targeted grants in local communities look. I also wanted to flag for local folks on this call to get plugged into your local Community Economic Resilience Fund region. The CERF, the SERF program, is a $600 million program that passed through SB 162 last year. And the whole idea is to fund projects that are happening on a regional basis. There are 13 regions throughout the state, and each region is supposed to have its own SERF network where folks can bring forth economic development projects to get funded through Cal OSBA. So definitely look up or reach out to me if you have questions, but your local CERF, your SERF program, get plugged in as quickly as you can so you can stay up to date on what's happening there. Oh yeah, that was the regions there. It will be provided to you in a slide deck following the webinar. And this is how you can get plugged into our network. So don't be shy, sign up to our newsletter, participate in any number of events that we have coming up. And we're always looking for small business owner stories to share with the local media or statewide media, as well as to elevate their stories in Sacramento and in Washington, DC, because that's the way we can really affect change. So that concludes my presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions y'all might have.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Yes, and Kelly, the great session, so much great information shared.